Who knows what Jay-Z, J.K. Rowling, Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey all have in common? Okay, I will tell you then. They have all overcome failure in one shape or form to go on to gain success in their respective careers. Welcome to My Perfect Failure. Join us as we delve into the world of our perfect failures. We will interview, explore, and discuss how our perfect failures can lead us to success. Join us and tune in.
Welcome everybody to another episode of My Perfect Failure. Today, I have another fantastic guest for you. So my guest today is a former CEO of Allegiant Bancorp. He grew multiple businesses, was involved in the casino business, and owned hundreds of properties. He is an entrepreneur, felon, author, and speaker with a BS in finance from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and a banking degree from Estonia Graduate School of Banking at the University of Delaware. He shares his lessons he's learned from his rise and fall to benefit individual groups and businesses. So a very, very warm welcome to My Perfect Failure, Shaun Hayes. How are you doing, Shaun?
I'm wonderful, Paul. Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate your time.
Well, I'm really excited. I'm always excited to have conversations, but I'm particularly excited to have this conversation because I think, you know, your journey has been an interesting one. I think everyone's going to hear a bit more about that in a second. I think you've had huge success, and then you've almost had this huge situation which can be positioned as a failure. But I guess what you're doing now, you're trying to correct some of those situations that you've encountered. But you know where I'd like to start? I'd like to start kind of at the beginning. And I'm just trying to picture you as a young guy when you're, I don't know, as a kid. Did you have ambitions as a kid? Because obviously business, we'll discuss in a minute, you know, you're an entrepreneur, you're a business guy, you've done extremely well. But as a kid, what excited you or motivated you as a young child?
I was always motivated. I love sports. And in my book, I talk about it was a way that over time I connected with my father, because many of us have strange relationships or a strange relationship with their father. And over time that did it. But I was also very entrepreneurial. It was not that you all like to hear this, but yesterday was Independence Day over here.
Yeah.
And many years ago, when I was out of college, I didn't have a job. And I think this sums up and my dad said, "What are you going to do?" And the next thing I know, I started a fireworks stand. And I literally learned how to make $20,000 40 plus years ago in 3 weeks and not work that hard. So that was that immediate kind of thing. And that led me to being a loan shark. If you read the book in college, I made a lot of money lending money to kids by kiting checks. And
What
I
does
didn't
that
know
mean?
that.
Sorry, kiting checks.
You can't do that anymore. But in the old days, a young man like you would come into me on Friday and you'd say, "Shaun, I got a hot date and I need $100. And on Monday, my parents put $200 in my account, or 200 pounds or whatever it is. And I'd say, "No problem, Paul, write me a check for 120. So you'd write me a check on Friday. Now, you wouldn't go deposit that till Monday. You'd go to some grocery store or the student union and cash the check and go out and have your weekend. And then I would go Friday night to the post office and mail it about 300 miles to my bank. And he'd get there by Tuesday. You on Monday would go to your bank in the town I went to college in. You would deposit my check. Your check would clear my bank like Tuesday night, Wednesday. My check wouldn't clear my bank till Thursday or Friday. So my bank thought I had $120. A check cleared for 100 and I was up 20. And that was living on the float.
So how did you learn that? Because that sounds quite intricate. That, even as you're explaining that even sounds like today something where I would need, I don't know, to store that information on a computer so I could track it. How did you come across that, and how were you able to track it? Were you just good with numbers, and were you just very organized?
Well, I was good with numbers, but I grew up literally in the United States on the Arkansas state line. So I never went out on a date that I didn't cross the street and go into Arkansas. And my family banked in Arkansas. and I went to college in central Missouri in Columbia, and I knew enough to know that it took many days for checks to clear.
Mm.
And in those days, the United States Postal Service was very dependable and very quick. And so literally my money got there before yours did. And I did have a little bit of money, but at one time I might have $40,000 or $50,000 in loans outstanding and only 20,000 in the bank because I was so good at the float. And but now with the way what Bank 24 is what it became in the US several years ago, now you can't float like that.
Okay.
But it was my introduction to banking because you asked me what I was like as a child. So I was athletic and entrepreneurial and as a young adult, but my parents told me that I could be anything. And this is where I believe environment's so important in life. If you're around positive people and they give you positive feedback, you'll try to do more things. And they said, you can be anything. But I said, I had a professor, he said, you should go into banking because 40 years ago it was changing. And of course they said, but a banker, because they hated bankers because they were small business people. And when you're in small business, you only answer to the bank and the IRS over here. And you don't like either one of them. But I started out in banking June 1st, 1982. And this is really the story that sums up my life. Right early on, they took all the management trainees and we had a test. I was at the parent company, so I didn't get to the testing site as quickly as the other people. So I had to sit on the front row. And by the time I had answered the first question, the proctor stopped the class and said, excuse me, question 1, you have to answer yes. And I said, wait a minute, sir. I said, this question says, have you stolen anything from this company? And my answer was no. And he looked at me and he said, son, very condescendingly, you will. He goes, just because you've been here 2 weeks doesn't mean that you won't. You'll take a pen, a pad of paper, you'll do that. And literally a couple months later, an older gentleman, well, not about that, his late 20s, said, hey, I know you're new to Kansas City. My girlfriend has a friend. Let's go on a date. And we went to a Kansas City Royals baseball game. And at the end of the night, I pulled out I said, what I owe you? And he said $90. And I gave him 90 in cash. And he used his company credit card to pay for it. And therein he had stole, for 90, but 180 from the company. And what happens is, and that's why I called the book The Great Choice. You slowly in life, unless you're in a very small percentage of people who are just criminal by nature, most people just make one decision and another decision. And then before you know it, over in my case, 30 some years, I ended up in the wrong place on my own.
Okay. So I definitely want to get into that in a minute. And I love that analogy of that really thin line between gray and black, because sometimes we cross it and we don't even realize we've crossed it, and we've crossed it.
See, and I would say, sorry, but I would say is little black and little white and a whole lot of gray.
Yeah.
Because most businesses, not that it's illegal or wrong, but you make your money in the gray. You push the envelope.
Yeah.
And I told that story about me in fireworks and in lending because I was taught to push and push and push and drive. And at 29, I, with another guy, bought a bank and drove 168 miles, Paul, one way to work.
So say that again.
I drove 168 miles one way to work, and only about 20 of it was interstate highway, and then about another 60 was 4-lane highway, and then the last 80 was 2-lane road. And I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. But the point is, banking is a pretty boring business overall. But in the 10 years that I was CEO, or actually I was CEO for 11 years, but in 9 years, I grew that company 80-fold. And you don't go banks 80-fold. That's unique. And we bought a bank at 29. I took it public at 35, and we sold it at 44 for almost $500 million, $475 million in the assumption of debt.
Sold it for how much? Sorry,
475 million plus debt.
So tell me a little bit about, so I'm intrigued around you and that, because that's almost, clearly you're a business guy and an entrepreneur, but to buy a bank and then go through the mechanics of growing a bank. So I think I read somewhere that you started from a small bank, you nurtured it into 38 banks or branches, sorry. Tell me about that process and your level of your growth ambition. You know, what were the ingredients within you that enabled you to have the ambition, the desire, the determination, whatever other ingredients you needed to achieve what you achieved?
Well, two things there. One, when I was in graduate school of banking, they taught us the low cost guy wins. And we'll talk about in any business, but if you're the low cost person, you can make a lot of mistakes and still win. So this gives you an idea. We bought the bank, we'd owned it for a few weeks, and we had $1,150,000 in cash in the vault. And my partner and I got to talking, and he said, you know, we don't need this much cash. And Fed funds overnight rates were like 9%. And he said, you know, let's take 750 of it. And if we take it to the Federal Reserve Bank, we'll make 5,000 plus more a month. So I picked up the phone and I called Brinks Armored Car and I said, I need you to pick up $750,000. They said, well, we can come in a week, literally a week from Thursday, and it'll be $250. And I said, let me call you back. And I hung up the phone. I walked back into my partner's office. I said, that's crazy. So Paul, this tells you a little bit about the drive, a little bit about cost. We literally loaded $750,000 of cash in the trunk of my car. Now, it isn't like in the movies where it's two briefcases. It's the cars, right? Because it's 5s, 10s, 20s, 50s, not, just hundreds that are brand new. And it was a dark October night. And I drove 168 miles with $750,000 of uninsured cash, with no security, no escort, all the way back to St. Louis, unloaded it in my family room. And at 4:30 in the morning, we got up and loaded it back in. And at 5 something in the morning, downtown at the St. Louis Fed, there's all these armored trucks lined up and one 1989 red Buick full of cash, for over $250. So that was the culture we had.
Yeah.
We'll do what it takes to be, to save money or to make money. And then it was just looking at business. I had really good investor partners who weren't bankers. And I think this is so true. And anybody that listens to your show that is in business, surround yourself with people who aren't in your business. Because if I,
your business
that aren't.
Okay, that's interesting.
And here's why. They look at things. So if I ever said, they would say, why do we do X? And if I said, well, that's the way it's always been done, guess what? We probably ended up changing it, because they constantly challenged, why are you doing it this way? Have you thought about that?
Okay.
And see, what they taught me right off the bat was, and this is where I see so many businesses make mistakes, you're not your own customer.
Mm-hmm.
Because I wanted to bank at Northern Trust or JP Morgan, I'm talking about the days when they were banks only, which were, beautiful buildings and traditional and oriental rugs and fireplaces and dark woods. And my customer, we bought a trailer truckload of seaweed green carpet because we got it for 12 and a half cents a square foot, because it was cheap. Yeah, my customer they cared about service. And since I grew up in a service industry family, we treated people like we wanted to be treated, but we knew they weren't our customers. So that's and we just grew like this. The other thing is, we went where other people weren't. The first bank that I bought in St. Louis, the second bank, was virtually 98% African-American, the highest murder rate, lowest income census tract in the St. Louis area. And we grew like crazy. We finally moved. We left a branch there. We finally moved because we didn't have a building big enough to house our people. Because everybody, why are you in that neighborhood? It was a great neighborhood to be in. You had no competition. You could do business anywhere in the metropolitan area you wanted to. It cost nothing for your real estate. And you never had a salesperson just show up and want to sell you something because they were afraid.
Oh, right. Okay.
We were crazy.
It almost sounds like which I find really interesting, that there's almost like a counterintuitive way that you were going, because I'm interested around where your competitors, your industry peers, when you were, I think you referenced that you had an African American clientele. That's what you were, an area that you focused.
That's where we started. And by the way, this was 33 years ago. I had African American and women directors day one. Today, that's almost forced on companies.
Yeah.
I want day one because you want to look like your community.
So what was the market? What were your peers saying at that time? Were they thinking, were they looking at you with, when people have that crooked eye, but they're thinking, what are they doing? These guys are crazy.
That's what they thought. And what we thought is, I never worry about my competition, never have. I don't care. See, since I played sports, I didn't want to be their friend. I wanted to inflict pain if I was playing football or basketball. I wanted to win. So we never paid attention. And when we started in St. Louis, we were the 42nd largest bank out of 43. When I sold, I was the 5th in town.
That's fun. I was going to say phenomenal, but it's clearly beyond that rate of growth starting from
and people just woke up one day and they're like, who are these people? And it's like any business. You're not an overnight success. You do it day after day after day. But it was a ton of fun.
Okay, it almost sounds, well, I'm super intrigued by that. It does sound phenomenal. So what I want to get into now is, had that phenomenal journey, phenomenal growth, going against the grain, achieving success, supporting community. So everything was fantastic, success. How did that success impact you? How did it make you feel? How did it make you act?
Well, I was very well grounded for a long time during that whole period. What happened was, it was mainly because I love people. To me, what makes life and business fun are people. I mean, today I'm excited I got to meet you. And quite honestly, I'll tell you, we'll have a relationship long beyond one interview, because people make life what it is. So I spent 15 years doing that and loving it. And it was all about people. Where I went wrong, and it cost me in business, and it cost me just about family, freedom, all kinds of things, is once I sold, I went to work for a Fortune 200. And we had 36,000 people. And when I wanted to go somewhere, they literally had an Air Force. So they sent a jet to get you in the morning to take you to a meeting, and they flew you home at night. And it was, what I said was, I made my living and my career, my success was based really on guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla marketing is one of my favorite books to these, but I was on the ground. I knew all that. And I spent 4 years in a big company where my theory of government and big companies are, you don't have to do hardly anything right, but God forbid you do one thing wrong. And I was a culture where we failed, that we didn't want to fail, but we did fail. But we learned from, we adjusted quickly. That was part, I said to the men and women around me from different industries, they challenged you to push so hard, but as you pushed and you knew it wasn't going right, then you adjusted. And that's why we were so successful. And you go to work for a big company, and they don't look at the world the same way. You don't have to do much right. And I lost total touch with not reality, but with the world I'd made my money in. And what happened was, that right there was my undoing, because you mentioned I was on the board of a publicly traded casino company, and getting a casino license in this, we actually had one in Coventry, by the way, that we opened at the football stadium. And
in the UK?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I know Coventry.
Yeah. And so we were in the basement of the stadium. And what happened was, to get a license, they look literally at every check you write. They know they would go in my neighborhood and ask my neighbors if my wife and I argued. And so I felt so vindicated on how clean I was. Self-righteous is probably a better word. And then the recession hit in 2008. And I had made these fatal errors. I had always made a ton of money in real estate, and I had a whole lot of bank stocks, and I owned banks. And when the world went against me, it went against me in a big way. As I said, I was losing $10 million a month. And so I looked at what a man had done legally almost 20 years before, and how he made a lot of money. And I structured a transaction like that. It was completely legal for one of my banks. And it was buying debt at a big discount and then working out of it, which is counterintuitive because most banks, they get a problem, they just want to, cut it out like cancer. And this man's strategy was he had great banks, and he would go find banks that had trouble loans, and he'd buy them at big discounts using the cheap bank deposits to fund them. And then he would book gains. And I found a transaction like that, and it was very lucrative for my bank. And the developer real estate professional that owned it was drowning. And he found a plastic surgeon, a car dealer, and another real estate guy who were all successful. And so the loans were done in those names. So my bank wasn't going to get scrutinized. At the end of the day, though, one of the banks said, I had a loan that I was in a partnership with a real estate guy. And they said, we won't sell these loans at this discount unless you're performing. Good loan goes with it. Well, in the United States, if you own more than 25% of a bank, you can't do business with yourself. If you owe less than 25, you have to have board approval. Well, I own 54, and this is where I believe that all bad decisions in particular are made out of fear and greed. And I'd lost so much money. I was running scared. There enters fear. And I saw this transaction and how lucrative it was, and there enters greed. And so I knew the day, Paul, that I made the decision, I was committing a felony. I knew it was wrong, but I justified it to myself in that I wasn't stealing money. I wasn't taking money. I was just usurping a law where it was a felony, but it wasn't going to be a problem. And what happened was I learned the most valuable lesson of my life next is that some people don't want things as bad as you do. I don't mean legal or illegal. I mean, you have partners. I've had a lot of partners in different businesses, and some have wanted things more than I have, and some have wanted things a lot less. And in that situation, the people wanted a lot less, and it all blew up. And at the end of the day, I not only usurped the law, I committed a felony. And the other thing in making my perfect mistake, because it was almost a perfect crime, because it was so complicated that when I finally went to plead guilty, I had to explain it to the government. They knew I'd done something wrong, but they couldn't figure it out. So they had a room full of forensic accountants to understand what I had done. And it was I went from a very high profile success to a very high profile failure. And unlike, as we jokingly say here, if I rob a 7-Eleven, they're after you in a matter of minutes. Well, the crime happened in 2009, and I didn't get indicted till 7 years later.
So you got indicted 7 years later. So
right.
When you made the decision, leading up to the decision, you mentioned that you were losing $10 million a month, which is, I can't even get my head around that number. So the transaction that you executed, was that to mitigate those losses?
Well, it was allowing my bank, one of the banks I own 54% of, to make a lot of money, which in turn would have benefited me.
Okay. Okay. So when you must have been under incredible pressure, losing $10 million a month. When you were going through this, did you have anybody in your corner, your team, that you could speak to and say, this is what's going on? What was that situation like? I was going to try and answer for you, but I'm just intrigued whether you were that successful up to that point that really didn't want to listen to anybody, or was it the nature of the losses? You were just so desperate that you just had to find a way.
Well, in my mind, you just hit the nail on the head, which I knew you were going to be a wonderful host. You understand the game. In those years of success, I had 4 people that I saw, probably 3 times a month, and we went through everything. None of them were bankers.
Mm.
And this was the problem. When you read the book, at 25, I ran corporate banking for the St. Louis metropolitan area for one of the largest banks in the Midwest. So everyone I knew in my life was 20 to 40 years older. So if you fast forward 25 years, as I say now, all my friends or partners are either old or dead.
Yeah.
So once I sold, Paul, I lost that core group. And that's one thing I talk to people about over and over. You have to have, and all kinds of people have said, you're only as smart as the 5 people you're around. You have to surround yourself with 3 or 4 or half a dozen people that are smart, talented, and driven. And see, once I sold, and this all happened 5 years after I sold, I lost all those people. Mm-hmm. Mainly now they're in their 80s, and now they're all dead. But at that time, they were in their 80s and they were done.
Yeah.
And they had been very successful in their own right. And so that, to me, is the perfect mistake I made. Was when I look back, what I had all along were people that I shared everything with, my successes, my failures, my opportunities, and all that. And at the same time, when I get out there and things are at their worst, I don't have that core anymore. And I lost that again, being at and I don't blame the company, but I lost that in those 4 years of being at a Fortune 200, because that's a whole different culture. That's a culture of, a corporation of peers mainly.
Yeah.
And not one of people who are pushing you and are pushing back at you. You have to have give and take. And I think that, we all look at relationships, good ones. They're not one-way streets. They're where people push you and you push them, and they question you and you question back. I think those are the best marriages, because when both people say what they think, both people don't always agree, but at least you have another perspective.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
I lost that.
Yeah. And even sometimes when we have those relationships, we don't have to agree immediately with what they say or agree at all. But sometimes they lay a seed that we can ruminate on. And actually that might impact a little bit of how we approach a situation. And so it doesn't have to be an emphatic, yes, agree with you, but it just gives us that perspective where we're able to maybe be more considered, even if we do decide to do what we're going to do in any random situation where we would engage with our peers.
Happen. That just wouldn't even happen. And by the way, I've never said that to anyone, but that you hit the nail on the head, though. In that case, they would have, 1, I probably wouldn't have gotten down as far as I got. Yeah. And 2, there's no way they would have made that an alternative. They would have given me other alternatives.
Mm. Well, that's it. I think obviously we're going to get into the upset that came from this, because obviously I know that you're incredibly remorseful, and there's lots of people that were affected by this. And I know a lot of the work you're doing now is about trying to compensate and to try and make good on what has been a very difficult situation. But I guess what I'm thinking about initially is there's probably very few people in the world that have a situation where they're losing £10 million a month. So when that's happening, it's like, how many people can you go to speak to actually have a conversation about it that can really wear your shoes at that time?
That's true. But, I would also say it's all relative to anybody. Well, the numbers, not as material as the experience. Mm. And if you keep yourself surrounded by people who've had success and had failure and will be honest with you, that in itself will keep you, true to doing the right thing and each situation. Because, one way or another, in my case, I got the privilege of just really having a train wreck. In fact, there's a quote in life that I know I'm one of the few people that can say this: seldom in life do you realize your greatest dreams, and Paul, I've exceeded mine,
Oh, wow.
or you realize your worst fears, nightmares, failures. And other than losing a child, I've experienced that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the extremes I've seen. And you mentioned this moment, and that's really what today I'm driven by two things. And one of them is, I spoke to a group a few weeks ago, and I got the kind of feedback that I really wanted, which is my mission all along is if I can change one person's life, it was all worth it. And when people say, wow, I get it, you feel like you're doing that. And secondly, I'm out involved in business and doing deals like I've always been. And so I look at things, would I change anything? No, because if you change one thing, you change everything. And two, other than the damage I did to my family, which that's something, time will heal it, but it's taken longer than I would have thought. I've learned so much, and I know that I am making a difference in so many people's lives through what I'm doing and what I've written, that I don't really want to say this, but I don't want to say it's worth it, but I understand it. And because it's been something I've never done. I have to say one thing, because you look so much like one of my two friends, that after I wrote the book, I had one friend that known me many years, and I have a man named Anthony who looks just almost like you. I can't wait to tease him now.
Guy, clearly.
Met your twin, Anthony. But they both said this to me. They said, don't you feel cleansed? And I have to say, after writing a book and telling the story in total honesty and with a lot of pain, I feel cleansed. And that cleansing that I've gotten over the last 5 months, as people have read it and told me, has given me the strength and the power and the drive like I had 40 years ago. So the game is so much fun this time. And I look at it very differently in a lot of ways. Before it was how fast can I do it? Now it's how well can I do it? And it's a fun run.
Yeah. And I guess those are lessons that we can only learn when, unfortunately, we make mistakes. Obviously, your one was a big one, and something you've had to pay the price for with your freedom. But just to, I guess, speak on, because I guess there are lots of different emotional phases you would have had to have gone through. You'd have had to have gone through the pressure that led to you to do what you did. You'd have had to have gone through the pressure of maybe that it always almost looking over your shoulder because you'd done something, and then you've got the people that are impacted because that they were, I guess, a consequence of it, and then obviously going to prison. So you've had to go through a range of different, pretty, I would imagine, quite extreme emotion. What has that been like for you? Because I guess we never equip ourselves to deal with such different levels of extreme emotions.
One, it takes a long time. Two, it's a lot like experiencing death, but but there are deaths, many deaths. There's the death, dealing with your loss of your family. There's death of friends when you lose your friends here, because it cost me family, friends, lots of money, freedom. And, so I have to say that it's still with you every day of your life. I live back in St. Louis, and I ran into a man yesterday afternoon on the way to a barbecue in Walmart who couldn't have been more kind and more gracious. What it does teach you is that humans are very adaptable and very resilient. And that's, and I believe that. And two, when I sent out an email about 60 days before the book came out to several thousand people in my contacts, and I titled it, Shaun is Back from the Dead. And I got hundreds of responses. And there were only 2 negative ones, and they were both girls that I dated in college and didn't marry. So I felt like people are as forgiving as you want to believe.
Yeah.
It changed I'm not never, I wasn't cynical before, but now that I'm certainly not cynical. If you own up and say you made a mistake and this is what I should have done 15 years ago, I should have said I made a mistake and owned up to it.
Yeah.
I failed.
Yeah.
Accept my, and as we talked before we started your show, failure is, as I've learned, is an event, and it isn't defined unless you quit. And if I would have just accepted the failure at that moment 15 years ago and worked my way through it, I would have gotten there. But for all that went on around me, I couldn't see that. So I want your listeners to realize it's an event. It doesn't define them. And for goodness sake, don't do anything illegal or malicious. Take the failure and figure out a way around it, and you will.
Yeah, and read your book, clearly. Definitely read your book. I wanted to ask you, the chap that you bumped into, was he a victim?
No, but I've bumped into victims. I don't say this in a diminishing way, but as far as financially, my restitution goes to the federal government and only to one victim. And he would invite me over to dinner if I called him. But I did hurt people. I hurt them. Most of whom I hurt, financially, it was minor in their world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there are a few that it would have been major. And most people that I've run into, and now that it's been, over 3 years that I've been out, I've not had anyone be anything other than gracious and accepting. No one's been stupid or angry. Now, there's a whole lot of people that weren't victims who don't talk to me, and I understand that as well. It doesn't hurt my feelings, or it tells me the ones that I didn't hurt financially that don't speak now. It tells me who they were all along. Because they really weren't who I thought they were. If they weren't hurt, and they can't even be gracious, but I feel horrible for, in particular, the employees of the bank, because they did lose money and jobs, and that's something you can't even fix with money, because you're talking several dozen people. They've scattered. It's been 10 years since that happened. They've scattered and gone, and there's just no way to make that good.
Yeah.
And that's you talk about a few things that gnaw on you. That's something that I'll never get over, because I hurt them, and there's truly nothing I can do to fix it.
I guess what I would say, and some people may not agree with me, but I think people were very resilient when we needed to be, and sometimes we find that inner strength, that inner ability that we never knew existed. And I've got my fingers crossed, and I'm very hopeful that those people will move on with their lives, and that they may not. Some may do better than others, but they have the capacity to move on and to have great lives.
That's what I want for them. And the thing is that you go through life and you don't ever want to hurt or take from. I've been a rising tide lifts all boats. And so that to me is my greatest failure, is that I failed people like that. Yeah. And that weighs, that's the one thing that gnaws or weighs on me. And a lot of things I can fix, or I can repair. That's not one I see how I can do. And again, that's, you don't want to hurt others. Yeah. Very few want to.
Yeah. So there's a couple of points that I'm keen to cover. So obviously you had this, we've mentioned this wonderful success, and then you had to experience prison. So that must have been incredibly difficult for somebody who would have experienced huge wealth, I guess, houses and cars and banks and everything. So how did you manage yourself during those 3 years?
Well, probably anyone you're going to interview that had my journey, I spent 17 months in a county jail, which is unheard of in this country. Virtually everyone I was in prison with literally got in their car and had someone ride with them, and they drove themselves to prison. And then when it was over, they picked them up. I spent 17 months where you stood up every day, and you, because you couldn't eat you couldn't sit when you eat, because you had to be ready to fight or flee. And I was in a place that was built for 24 men, and 36 lived in it. and it was about 6 feet by 10 feet or 11 feet. And so I had a different thing. What I chose to do in those 17 months was I accepted no money from anyone, because you can buy, they call it commissary, but you can buy, potato chips and snacks and things like that. And that was my way of, one, preparing myself for this journey, and two, a little bit of self-punishment. And so then after 17 months, I went in the federal prison system, and I called the first place that I was at for 10 months a summer camp that your parents signed you up for, but the brochure was 20 years old. And the second place I went was on a military base, and it was much nicer, but it was a fraternity house with no girls. And so I would say that those part of my journey, the 20 months of the 37, were truly not, by then I was so mentally prepared and into it. And what it does is, if you choose the time, it gives you a tremendous amount of time to work on yourself. And a lot of that dealing with deaths, as I said, not a death, but many deaths, I got to do in that 37 months. So, it was not something I would wish on anyone, but I'm a better person for it. And not because of the system, because the system here, Paul, is horrifically broken. In fact, it's in particularly, almost everyone there's a minority. So I could just go down list after list of social justices that our system doesn't eliminate. It actually continues to create and exacerbate. But for me, it was not anything, again, I would wish on anyone, but I accepted, I committed the crime, and that was the cost.
Okay. So obviously you've navigated that period. You're out now, and you've written your book, and you're speaking, you're supporting businesses, you're inspiring people. And I wrote down earlier before we started recording, because you're incredibly entrepreneurial, business focused, you achieved a lot, which I didn't know about the counterintuitive nature of the banking business and how you achieved there. So I was kind of theorizing before I met you, because I was intrigued to have this conversation with you, that maybe there's a new challenge for you. Maybe there's a new challenge where you can achieve, it might not be, the measurements might be different, but actually you can actually achieve the same level of success. Whatever metrics you use to gauge that might be money, it might be something else. But actually, so I was keen to ask you that question. What's your new challenge? What do you want to do next? So you're clearly very capable.
Well, and I do that twofold. One, because when you're single and you don't have children and things, you have a lot more time than you used to have. But money is the scorecard. So money isn't a goal. It comes, but it's the first part of what I do is it's the people I talk to in the groups of trying to help people stay out of the gray. It's like I say this, we used to spend tons of times in our company deciding what the minimum level of gift an employee could accept from a customer. If I had to make that decision now, it would be 0. Because whether you give me a pen, a pencil, $100 gift or $1,000 gift, you slowly have started into my head to where I'll make a bad decision at some point, whether that was your intent or not. So that's half of it. The other half of it is that I'm out there in business. I'm involved in hundreds of millions of dollars of real estate right now, with a bunch of really great people, and I'm involved with a cloud kitchen company, and so I'm having fun like I've never had. I look at the world so differently, and I was reading this weekend. I love to read. I tell everybody, read.
Anything in particular, or anything?
Well, I have a few books I always think people should read, but it's really, and listen. See, to me, your world has changed everything. When I exercise, I listen to shows like yours. When I'm in the car, I listen to shows like yours, because the only way you can accomplish things are with knowledge. But it was interesting. I read this weekend, and it just resonated with me. And to my generation, success was a big house and nice cars. Today, success is freedom. And when you've been through what I've been through, and you've had houses and cars and traveled the world and all that, it is, at the end of the day, it's about freedom. And I've experienced freedom at its worst and freedom at its best. And that's what I think that people in your generation and younger have now. You don't look at life of, I have to go to an office and I have to do this and I have to do that. You look at, I do what I want to do. I do it when I want to do it, and I do it how I want to do it. And that, to me, is what really the scorecard is now. And that's why when I listen to someone like you and I listen to your show, you're talking about helping me get to do what I want to do now. And that's different than for, 5 or 6 generations before.
No, I know that I don't, I guess I'm learning more about your journey and so forth, but I think you've got another opportunity now. It sounds like, you have taken it and you are doing some really positive things. And I think it'd be very easy for you maybe to have gone another route, but your higher purpose is coming into play and you're doing something wonderful. I was listening to one of your interviews and you said something that caught my attention and I want to share it with everybody else. So the consequences of failure are far less than the consequences of committing a crime. So I think that's a lovely statement for everybody to ponder and consider. So
true. And ChatGPT didn't say that. I did.
Sorry?
I said ChatGPT didn't say that.
Yes, So sometimes I do articles. So sometimes I quote people. When I use that one, I will reference you. You will be quoted.
Thank you.
You will be quoted. So, and as we wrap up, I just wanted to ask about the book. When did the idea come into play, and when did you decide that this is something you were going to do?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. In 2016, the week before Christmas in 15, I knew I was going to get indicted. And they said any day. And so by January, I was extremely depressed. And I called a woman that I'd known through business that runs a large speakers bureau. And I told her what was going to happen. I don't know why. I'd met her 4 or 5 times and done some business with her. And she said, Shaun, write a book. And this was my quote. Paul, I said, Gail, I'm not that interesting. And then over the next several years, I read a lot of books. And I called her back and I said, I'm still not that interesting, but I'm more interesting than most of these people who've written books.
Yeah.
And so that was the reason. And I knew I was going to do it. And I just didn't know when. And then I became very ill. And as my friends would say, I tried to die in the winter of 22, not from the cancer I got that came back in 21, but from pneumonia. Okay. And I lay 6 weeks and literally dictated a book into my iPad. And that was the beginning of the journey. And in the book company said, what are you really after here? And I said, redemption, but I don't know what it looks like. But my friend Anthony, who looks like you, and my friend Jim, who's my age, they gave me redemption by telling me, don't you feel free? And when I looked at it, I said, I feel the freest I've ever felt in my life. So that was the impetus, and that was when I did it, and that was the result. And people have been wonderful. I've had so many people help along the way. I will tell you this, and if anybody wants to write one, you should. And 2, no one I knew read it till the day it came out, because I believe that you want it to be your voice.
Yeah. And I understand that the book is doing very well, and you've got some wonderful reviews.
And by the way, anyone who reads it, please, anytime you read anyone's book, please take the time to review it. When you go down this process, you learn that really all that matters are reviews.
Yeah, totally. And obviously, I'm going to put a link to the book in the bio. But who is the book specifically for? Are you speaking to a certain voice? Is it for a certain audience?
I believe, because that's who they ask you your audience is. I believe the book is best suited for either the aspiring or the new entrepreneur. Either someone who thinks they want to be an entrepreneur, or someone who's out there. And back to what you said, who's around you? Did you have people around you then, and things like that? Because when you're out there on your own, as I say, it's very easy to get paid. It's hard to make payroll, and things like that. So it's for someone who's thinking about jumping into that icy cold water, because it's about a journey of someone who achieved unbelievable success and at the same time unbelievable failure, but I'm still there. And you were gracious enough to quote me in that, and that's why I told you I love your title, My Perfect Failure. But failure doesn't define you if you don't quit.
Absolutely.
And that's what people have to realize.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always another side of the coin. And I think failure is, I love Oprah Winfrey's slant on it, where she talks about the idea that when we experience failure, our job is to look for the opportunity in that. There's always seeds of opportunity. There's always seeds of insight. There's always seeds of a way forward. And I think that it's very easy to lose all sense of opportunity, all sense of hope, if we don't train the mind to really support us and really help us move forward. So yes, I definitely take your point that we shouldn't quit. Shaun, I've really enjoyed this discussion. I hope to have many more discussions with you, because I know that your journey has been a difficult one. I know that you're remorseful about the things that have happened, but what does inspire me is the fact that you are on a mission to do good and to lead a purpose where actually you're leading a positive life and you're supporting people and inspiring people. So that really is a positive message to leave for everybody.
Thank you. And thank you for being your unbelievably good interviewer. But I love the compassion that I feel through our conversation. That means so much to me. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, you're very welcome, very welcome. But I do have one question for you. I do need you to answer this question. So if you could invite 3 inspirational people for dinner, they can be alive or past, who would you invite?
Well, you have to invite Jesus Christ, whether you're religious or not, because 2,000 years of history are so impacted. The second one you should be very proud of, because I've read so much about this man, Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, he was the 20th century.
Mm.
And as an American, it has to be Abraham Lincoln, because he dealt with racism and slavery and tried to keep a union together. And so those would be the 3 people. And I think it'd be great. You could ask one question and you don't have to say a word the rest of the night.
Imagine having that dinner. That would be literally so phenomenal. That'd be so phenomenal. I'm just picturing those, you 4 at the table. That would be, I don't know where you would start in terms of the conversation, but maybe you would just let it organically evolve and see what seeds and ideas were discussed and shared. But Shaun, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to have you on My Perfect Failure, and I look forward to reading your book, but also having more discussions with you. So thank you so much.
Paul, thank you, and have a wonderful day. And I thank your guests for your time today. Take care.
Lovely. And thank you, everybody, for tuning into this episode of My Perfect Failure. We're always looking to grow the show, so please do share this episode far and wide even, particularly if you know people that have experienced difficult moments or are experiencing difficult moments. This is definitely an episode you should share with them. And your feedback is always very welcome. So we're keen to hear about the things that you like and equally the things that you don't like. So you can find me at paul@myperfectfailure.com, or you can find me via the contact page on the website. So take care for now. Bye.
Thanks for listening to My Perfect Failure podcast. Be sure to visit www.myperfectfailure.com to join the conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Google Play. Look out for our next episode.